Entrando em contato com o atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E, como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Hello, my name's David Runciman and this is Past, Present, Future, and today is the start of a new series. It's about historical what-ifs or counterfactuals. What if a small thing had happened and the world had turned into a completely different place? We're starting today with a conversation with the geneticist and science writer Adam Rutherford, which is both a general conversation about whether it even makes sense to think of science, scientific discovery, scientific progress as a what-if question. Does it really matter who discovers what and when? But it's also a specific conversation about something that happened in 1913, which changed the world, and what the world might have been like if it had never taken place. Adam, we actually touched on counterfactuals in our episodes for the series on the history of bad ideas, actually in both of them, both talking about taxonomy and also eugenics. And we just touched on the wider question, which is, does it really make sense to think of scientific discovery in the terms of counterfactuals? So we're going to have that conversation now. It's actually part of the inspiration for this series, the fact that we touched on it then. We're going to come to some specific examples later on. But there is a broader question. It's almost a philosophical question. Maybe it is a philosophical question, the philosophy of science, which is, does it really make sense to ask what-if questions about scientific discoveries? What if this hadn't been discovered by this person in this time? Would everything have been different? Because I'm aware there are different views about this, and there certainly is a view of scientific discovery that suggests that it's kind of out there waiting to be discovered. It's like, it's a landscape that is obscured by fog, and we're feeling our way along the edge of this landscape, and it's there to be revealed. It's not like the people who are discovering this stuff are creating the landscape. The landscape already exists, and human beings are on the edge of that landscape, feeling their way in the fog. And if this person doesn't put his or her, in history usually his, hand out and find the thing, someone else will. I'm genuinely curious, which way do you incline on that? Even if not philosophically, sort of instinctively or personally, do you feel like scientific counterfactuals are likely to be overblown in that respect?
So I can answer this question with a real event that happened not that long ago when I was doing a live show, and there was a question from the audience, from an audience member who's familiar with my output. So background, I spent all my adult life studying genetics and evolution, and I'm something of a Darwinologist, so somewhat obsessed with the figure at the top of the evolutionary tree. But they were also aware, based on my social media witterings, of which I appear to be sadly addicted, that in our household I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, right? Which I think is true. It may be simply that the presence of daughters in my house has made Taylor Swift so ubiquitous that I have become a fan by default. So the question was, you get to choose one and the other one doesn't exist or has never existed. And I think everyone was assuming that I would just instinctively say Charles Darwin. But the answer was, without skipping a beat, it was obviously Taylor Swift. Because, and this plays exactly into the question you're asking about the utility of counterfactuals in scientific history. The answer was Taylor Swift on the grounds that evolution is an empirical reality. It was waiting to be discovered. And in fact, it was discovered pretty much exactly at the same time by Alfred Russel Wallace. And it was Russel Wallace's letter to Darwin in 1858, which prompted Darwin to actually go public and publish The Origin of Species. So two people came up with the same idea at the same time. So if Darwin had never existed, then Evolution by Natural Selection would have been published probably in the form that we understand it today within a year or a couple of years. Whereas if you run the tape of the universe again, then Shake It Off is never written. There isn't a version of the universe where Taylor Swift's output comes out exactly the same way as the reality of evolution by natural selection. So that's a long, boring anecdote to get to the point where it leads me down the pathway of thinking that if we accept that there is an empirical reality out there, then it is waiting for us to discover it. And it sort of doesn't matter who discovers it, because someone will eventually.
I'm tempted to get sidetracked into a Taylor Swift conversation here, because there is a version of that running the universe without her where you wouldn't notice her absence because you wouldn't be aware of her, but something else would have filled that space. And as the father of teenage girls, you'd probably be just as keen on whatever the alternative thing is. I remember reading quite an interesting account of the Harry Potter phenomenon that says the key way to think about the Harry Potter books is that it's an example of purely random success. Something always takes off in this way. There's a kind of social contagion around certain things. It's random. We then tell a backstory which says it succeeded because it was so brilliant. But actually, if you run the universe again, it wouldn't have been Harry Potter, but it would have been something else. And we would be just as convinced that the world would never be the same without it.
Yes. I mean, I can't believe you missed the opportunity to refer to a blank space that would have been occupied by something other than Taylor Swift. But obviously, you're not Swiftie enough to mention
know what you're talking about there.
It's one of her better songs. No, I think that's right. But I think that also brings us to a different context for this question, which is what is the environment in which scientific ideas emerge? Because, when you asked me this, and I was thinking about, well, Darwin and Wallace come up with natural selection at the same time. Another great example that we often talk about is Newton is given credit for inventing calculus, but actually Leibniz did possibly before, or possibly almost exactly the same time. And in the English telling of the history of mathematics, we tend to say it was Newton, whereas in the German version, they tend to say it was Leibniz. And there, I think, is where this question becomes really interesting to me, which is how we teach the history of science and how we teach it in a very old-fashioned Whiggish way, that it's a succession of people doing great things. And by people, I mean almost exclusively men. And in the sense that academic history moved away from that great men theory decades ago, I don't think the history of science has done that. And so it is still important in our narrative construction of the history of science that Newton did this, that Einstein did this, that Darwin did this, that Crick and Watson did these things. And that's how we tell the history of science. And I think it's wrong, and I think it's bad.
I don't know if the metaphor works. I've seen it written down by various people that they think about scientific discovery in this way, but I'm not sure how widespread it is. But the idea, as you said, it's an empirical reality, but it is a kind of landscape that's out there and it's obscured to us. For whatever reason, it's hidden from us. There is a set of truths about the universe that pre-exist us and aren't dependent on us and will continue to be true even if we're not around. But we unveil them. But it is a vast landscape. And human beings, maybe machines one day will map all of it, but human beings probably never will. And if you do think of it as like a landscape that we're mapping our way through, it presumably does make a difference, like the old joke, I wouldn't start from there. Where you start, and as it were, the next thing that gets revealed will lead you down a path, and it would be a somewhat different path. You would be exploring a different part of the landscape if actually at that time you had revealed something a mile to the left or a mile to the right. And I'm thinking particularly of the example that you mentioned when we were talking in the previous series with you, which is what might have happened to the way that we think about biology and human difference if genetics had been discovered earlier. So the who question is probably overblown. Take Newton out, we've still got a similar understanding of the world by now. But the when question probably does matter. And it seems at least possible that you could have quite different worlds as experienced by humans if we stumbled upon this part of the map a bit earlier. So the genetics example, which I think was the one that you touched on then, Mendel and genetics. I don't know enough about the history, so you're going to have to explain. Was it conceivable that someone like him, maybe another monk, but 100 years earlier, 200 years earlier, could have stumbled upon that little part of the hidden world? And had that happened, would we then have gone down a very different path?
Well, that's an excellent question and opens up all sorts of doors that, I sometimes get my students to think a little bit of these ideas. And I think one of the things that often, it's so obvious, but I think it often gets overlooked in thinking about the sort of social and cultural context of these great discoveries that move us forward in science, and that they're almost all technology dependent. So, to a lesser extent in sort of Newton's example, which is really just pen and paper mathematics, although his observations about gravity are very dependent on the movement of the planets and the stars, which of course is dependent on lenses and telescopes. When it comes to something like the formulation of genetics as we currently understand it, that was done through breeding programs for Mendel himself. So that certainly could have been done at any time in agricultural history, at least in some forms.
I mean, could Aristotle have done it? That kind of thing. I mean, a curious mind in ancient Greece, at least a sort of inkling of what might be out there. Could that have been done that far back?
Let me think about this for a second. I think probably the answer in terms of the breeding programs is yes. But I think in terms of the intellectual development of the process of science, I think the answer is probably no, because we often put Aristotle as not just as one of the founding great Western philosophers, but also he is effectively the father of biology. But he wasn't an experimentalist. So it was very observation-based. I imagine that there are going to be some Aristotle biology experts who are furiously typing emails to me right now. But the development of what are casually referred to as the scientific method, singular, but actually are really a set of tools in the 16th, 17th century, largely in London and Cambridge and also in Berlin and Paris. But the Royal Society, the formulation of the Royal Society was key to the development of this idea that doctrine is gone and that testing things is everything. Nullius in verba is the motto of the Royal Society, which is basically don't take anyone's word for it. Test this stuff for yourself. And I wonder whether the experimental aspect of Mendel's project, which I have many times said I think is one of the best designed experiments in the history of humankind, I wonder whether it would have been tackled in an experimental way, a hypothesis-driven way that has become the sort of foundation for most of science today. I don't know the answer to that. If Aristotle certainly was capable of doing that, but whether he would have done it from an intellectual point of view, I don't know.
But even on the account that says Aristotle couldn't have done it, the Royal Society was around from the second half of the 17th century onwards. We talked about Linnaeus and the impact of Linnaean taxonomy on how human beings came to understand their own species, essentially, with, as you argued pretty persuasively, some catastrophic effects. Now, there's I don't know the exact number, but there's a 70-year window or something within which the scientific method applied to this kind of experiment, if someone had been clever enough to devise it. But the point about Mendel is that he's not quite an everyman, right? But you sort of feel like if he could have done it, it must have been possible for people in quite a wide range of settings to do it. What would have happened if that had happened in 1700? And so by the time people were taxonomizing the world, they had come to an understanding that actually what lay behind that, the thing, they felt their way in the map to this bit of the landscape, but actually there's this huge vista behind that, and they had a glimpse of it already.
Again, a really interesting question. This relates to not the taxonomy episode, but the eugenics episode, because what we actually see in the years following Mendel's effectively describing not just units of inheritance, which become known as genes, but the pattern of that inheritance, that actually it's a statistical, predictable flow of discrete units of inheritance that pass from parent to child in all species, Mendelian inheritance. But what then happens in the 20th century is that, particularly in America, less so in the UK, but in America, the eugenicists latch onto this idea because it gives them a pivot on which to enact their eugenics policies. So everything has a gene associated with it, from eye color to seafaringness or sexual proclivities or anxiety or things that we know now are complex and involve the environment and many genes and so on. But that idea, and this I think talks to all of my work and talks to this counterfactual question as well, that idea is that a new scientific discovery is marshaled into a pre-existing political ideology. And the idea of genes predates Mendel arguably by a couple of thousand years. And there's one example that I use which comes from the Talmud, which is that there's a passage in the Talmud which describes how if newborn boys have bled to death at circumcision, then if I can't remember the exact numbers, but if two brothers have, then the third brother and a cousin are exempt from it. And what they're describing is haemophilia. And so the exemption, there are a small proportion of Jewish boys today who are not circumcised because haemophilia runs in their family. And I use this as an example of the first example of Mendelian inheritance. There's a unit which is passed from parent, well, in this case, from parent to son. And as a result, and it's lethal if in a particular pattern. Another example I use is how the Habsburgs, famous for being incredibly inbred, but also with this characteristic jaw and lip, which you can see in all of the portraits of the Habsburgs from the 15th century to the 17th, and in fact on. But that look, that the inheritance pattern is seen as a badge of honor because it's divine, and actually what they're doing is they're massively inbreeding and causing an end to their grip on power, because eventually Charles II, Carlos el Hejizado, the Hexed, is cursed with impotence and sterility and produces no male heir. But they're still looking for a unit of inheritance which is passed down through families. So I think that Mendel's discoveries, whilst being foundational to modern genetics and one of the greatest experiments of all time, sort of well sits into the model that I see quite often and that I write about and worry about, which is how new discoveries become instantaneously politicized or used for political gain. So, I mean, that doesn't really answer the question about whether Linnaeus, if he'd known about genes in the Mendelian way, would history have looked different? But I think it's the same sort of tack. If Linnaeus had understood that true human variation was actually not reflected by pigmentation, but actually was continuous, and that the racial structures that he imposed and then everyone followed, if he had realized that that was not true, then it may well be that the racial taxonomies that we continue to use today would not be still in use today. But does that mean that forms of bigotry and colonialization and empire would not have existed? I suspect not. It's just that people always turn to the authority of science, and new science in particular, which we don't really understand yet, and say, well, look, the scientists say this, therefore we are justified in doing this. And, that juncture is the bit that I'm fundamentally interested in.
Entrando em contato com atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
So on a completely different tack, but the same theme, I sometimes find myself thinking about this in relation to AI and artificial intelligence. So you do get a lot of the most blunt technological determinism coming out of people in Silicon Valley who more or less say, we're on a path. It's an inevitable path to the discovery of things that are 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. They describe the map in temporal terms, not spatial terms, but it's like we're going along this path and round this corner will be this and that corner will be that. For some of them, then it ends in Oz and the singularity. For others, it ends with thinking machines that are smarter than we are and so on. But as you go down that path, it's always being described by these people as that path. So you could redescribe the path. You could still believe that there is a sort of inevitability to progress in that area. But it's not progress towards intelligence. So it makes a big difference whether or not you call it intelligence. It could be progress towards ever more sophisticated forms of mimicry. People who denigrate it, who say this is just these are parrots. These aren't, even the super smart ones are still just parrots. But it also is clearly feeding into a much, much wider mindset about the nature of progress, including the nature of political progress. It's often associated with a view that in 10 years or 20 years, these machines will be supplanting other sorts of bureaucratic or human inventions. So a lot kind of depends, even if you believe that the truth is out there, a lot depends on who gets to describe the journey. And it seems like it's comparable to what you just were laying out, which is, as it were, something else was going on, which is a journey had already been described when the discovery was arrived at, and it was just placed into that path. And AI feels similar to me, actually.
But do you want to make the distinction between invention and discovery, though? So I'm thinking that there's biology out there and we're looking for how it works, compared to inventing something which changes the sort of framework in which science is done.
Yeah, and I think the big shift in AI is that I'm not an expert in this, but for a long time the thought was it would depend on discovery. Someone was actually going to have to discover something about, say, the seat of consciousness in human beings that could then be recreated artificially or mechanically. And that became famously the AI winter, because actually, we're not that much further, I don't think, to knowing the secret to human consciousness. And therefore, for a long time, very little progress was made when the belief was that it would rest on discovery. All the progress has been made by ditching all of that and simply fine-tuning the machines, not thinking too hard about the profound question of what it is they're doing, and simply making them better and better at the thing that they seem to do very well, which is trawling through these vast data sets and predicting what human beings might do based on what human beings have done. And yet, what's interesting is it is being redescribed in the language that's been drawn from the heroic failure discovery years. Because you might want to say, well, it's clearly not intelligence. But all of the mythology around this is that all of this has been progress towards artificial intelligence. So in a way, I think probably the two things have got a bit jumbled up in a way that does have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I was thinking you're absolutely right, because as we both said earlier, it's all technology dependent, and most technological developments are scientifically dependent. So in your case, it's to do with computing power. Right. So the more computing power that we have, which is dependent on more fundamental understanding of atoms and if we get to quantum computing properly, then the game is going to change again, because the power goes up by orders of magnitude, which means more sophisticated modeling, and we're into the realms of, complete modeling of the universe.
Did you ever read Ian McEwan's novel, Machines Like Us?
I did not. I am a fan of McEwan's earlier work, but I didn't get to this one.
So that one has an interesting counterfactual. I'm just going to throw it out there because it actually connects what we started with and where we've wound up, which is it's about a world in which Alan Turing doesn't die relatively young. So it's set in a recognizable Britain, I think, of the 80s, in which Turing is the grand old man of British science and British technology, and he's cracked it. Like if he'd had another 30 years, that period which I talked about, which was the AI winter, actually the implication is it's because the British state, with its harsh views about homosexuality, and then, depending on what you actually think happened to Turing, the knock-on effects on him, destroyed the person who was on the path. It's quite an interesting novel, but it's not particularly convincing, not least because it has to, as with a lot of these counterfactuals, it has to mash together a world that we recognize, a sort of familiar world of Britain at a certain period, with thinking and sentient robots. And you sort of feel, if we'd got off the path in one area, wouldn't we have got off the path? This is the classic problem of sci-fi. If we get off the path in one way, why have we stayed on the path in all the other ways? But it is an interesting question about Turing, I think, at least potentially, had he lived.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you were saying that, I was thinking of, because I love counterfactual fiction, and I think it's often done averagely or poorly. Watchmen was, I guess, the first one that I really engaged with. You know, it's the timing of when I read that. So this is Alan Moore's graphic novel, in which the basic premise is that superheroes are real, right? And there was some point in the 20th century where the people who were in our comics as Batman and Superman and the Flash and whoever actually did exist. What does society look like when a proportion of people have powers beyond those of normal humans? And, you know, did we talk about the time machine, or did I listen to you talking about the time machine?
You listened to me talking about the time machine.
I did. That's true. Well, I talk about the time machine in talking about eugenics, because I maintain that it really is a book about eugenics, and Wells was really interested in. Well, he vacillated about it. You know, one week he was pro, one week he was anti. But again, it's that notion where there's a thing happens and society changes as a result. As always with these conversations that me and you have, I wonder whether I'm persuading myself or arguing myself off the perch, which is fun. But I think I'm going back to the basic premise that counterfactuals in science are not useful because they're only dependent on the personalities of the people who discover them, I think.
So before we get on to a specific example, I want to try and push back a bit on that. So there's the question about who, and maybe who doesn't matter that much, even with Alan Turing. There's the question about when, and maybe when does matter a bit, but you've suggested it might be that there's sort of other kinds of path dependency at work. But there's also the question about where these things happen, as it were, where that bit of the map is revealed. And it does tend, for the reasons that you say, because it's dependent on technological power, to happen in places that already have power and wealth. And I think there is a wider question here which touches on all sorts of things. Should we be thinking about scientific discovery, the discovery of the truth, as something that could happen anywhere? Or do we know enough about history to know that actually, in most cases, it happens where you would expect it to happen? That is, it happens in the places where the resources already are. So it could have been Darwin, it could have been Wallace, but after all, that's not a huge spread in terms of the human population. These two people are in the same place and they know each other. And there are huge concentrations, not just of wealth and of power, but of knowledge. If you think of the West and China as being roughly at the same level of both economic and scientific development in the 17th century, and then you get this massive divergence, and a million books have been written about what caused that divergence. One of the hypotheses is that it is the scientific revolution. Why does the scientific revolution happen in a certain way, in a certain place? Is it because the West got lucky and then the power and wealth follows? Or is it because, in a way, there was already a concentration of something in certain places and you would expect experimentalism and innovation to happen in places that can already afford to do it? It seems like there are two possible paths here, and it does matter about how we think about the world and what we should distribute in the world. I used to think about it in relation to universities all the time. Some people who are arguing that universities should be concentrations of knowledge and wealth and power, and other people argue that if a country is going to prosper, you need to distribute this across the country. So there's about three questions in one, but the basic question is, does it matter where? Does it matter where?
Well, I think it absolutely does matter where. And I think it probably matters for the reasons that you've just outlined, which is that the hegemonic power structures are already in place. So you're sitting in Cambridge right now. Now, I think I'm right in saying there are more Nobel Prize winners or winnings within probably a mile of where you're sitting than in the rest of the world combined. Now, does that mean that there is something in the water at Cambridge which makes clever people cleverer? No, I don't think it does. But it's an environment that for several centuries now has nurtured the type of thinking that is rewarded by the system that likes that type of thinking. Now, that's not to denigrate Cambridge or any of the great learning establishments of the West, but it is just a fact that the type of intellectual development that happens in those places can and is mostly continuous, because of the nature of knowledge is that we pass it down from our parents to our children, our sort of academic children. And so I think there is something to be said about the atmosphere in certain establishments, which is informative. One of the great scientific discoveries of the 20th century was, of course, the description of the double helix structure of DNA, which is credited to Crick and Watson and Maurice Franklin, and subsequently the work of Rosalind Franklin, which was foundational to it, has been credited. So Crick and Watson are in Cambridge, but Wilkins and Franklin are in King's, and various versions of the history as we're now retelling it, because most of the history until the 21st century was described in Watson's book, The Double Helix, which is best interpreted as a novel, as a sort of thriller. It's a fictionalized account and dramatized, and it's brilliant for it, but it shouldn't be assumed that this is actually what happened. I think there's a real sense that the intellectual environment at Cambridge, provided a different framework than the intellectual environment at King's, in which Rosalind Franklin has been described in various biographies as not being happy. She was happier in Paris, where she was regarded much more openly as a woman. This is in the 1940s and 1950s, whereas at King's she was sneered at. In Watson's account, he is openly sexist in the first version towards her. He describes her as being, I forget the exact awful quote, but if she wore a pretty dress once in a while or tied her hair up, she'd be much more attractive. And there's an ironic moment that's described in some of the history. Matthew Cobb writes very well about this, that if Watson had been paying more attention to a lecture that Franklin gave several months before their discovery, then he might have got the double helix structure earlier than he actually did. But instead, he was looking at what she was wearing and what she looked at. So there's a counterfactual, there's a tiny, tiny niche counterfactual for the historians of genetics there, which is, what if Jim Watson hadn't been such a sexist prick? What would have happened to the discovery of DNA? But then there's another version of this as well, which was that it was a race. And around the world, people really were competing to try and understand it. Linus Pauling came up in 1953, just before the publication of the double helix, with a triple helix version. And it was wrong. But I do think that, going back to my original point, I do think that if Crick and Watson hadn't got there, using some of Franklin's work, then Pauling would have got there. We're pretty sure that Franklin wouldn't have, because she'd actually lost interest in the subject by then, was working on something else. I don't feel like this is a sort of, mega pivotal one that changes the whole narrative of history. It just changes the narrative of the stories we tell about scientific history. And Crick and Watson don't get the Nobel, and who knows what happens to them. But actually it goes to Linus Pauling or some of the other players at this time. So important, yes, but in a really niche way. It's not the same as, what if Hitler had died as a baby? Or one of those, great counterfactuals which allow us to explore history.
We're going to come on to one of those, but I still want to ask you a bit more about that big question of whether you think we should think about, let's call it scientific progress. Maybe that's the wrong word, but scientific progress as being primarily aided by people doing what they can to concentrate resources in one place, versus the other view, which is, the wider the distribution, the opportunity for people who would have no chance to be the one who inquires, and maybe hidden geniuses in all sorts of surprising places. And I'm sure it depends a bit on the science. So maths, with maths, there might be someone in an obscure village in India, as there famously was, who comes to the attention of someone in Cambridge and gets plucked out. But, that's a pen and paper project. But most contemporary science depends on a lot of resource input, doesn't it? And there is a question, which is in part a political question, as to whether success for a nation or for an institution or for the species depends on us doing everything we can to concentrate those resources. Or are we now, thanks partly to information technology, living in a world where we should be doing what we can to distribute those resources, to give as many people as possible the chance to play the game? Seems to me like that is a real question. It is a question about how wide is the counterfactual canvas here, because on the second account, the thought is lots of different people could do it. On the first account, the thought is actually it will only happen where quite a lot of smart people are gathered together in one place.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think there's two slightly separate ways of thinking about this. And the first is the obvious one, which is that the concentration of scientific discoveries that the West has enjoyed.
The world has endured and the West has enjoyed.
The world has endured, yeah. Yes, genuine Freudian slip there. Is almost exclusively to do with privilege. Because most of these great theoretical discoveries, or discoveries which are pure research rather than directly applied research, are dependent on having the liberty to do the work instead of working in the fields, right? Or working in factories. I don't think that feels uncontroversial for me to say. I think the counter to that is wartime is often the period of the greatest scientific and technological developments out of necessity. So there's a slight balance to the sort of serendipity of discovery through privilege. Darwin had a 6-year gap year because he was independently wealthy, came home, bought a sodding great mansion in Bromley, and spent the next 30 years writing what I consider to be the most important work in the English language. And it was nice that he did that, and I'm very grateful that he did. There's a quote that I think of quite often by Stephen Jay Gould. He said some pithy lines. And one of them was this: when he was asked about what was special about Einstein's brain, Gould was a Marxist or a communist, but he was very left-wing, and that was part of his view of science. But he said this thing, which I think is important. He said, I'm somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. Now, if you take the view that's not the blank slate view, which I do not hold, but that's the distribution of the variance of human inherent capabilities is spread widely over the world rather than concentrated in specific groups and specific culturally designated, mostly racialized groups. If you don't believe that, then what that says to me is that the reason so much scientific discovery occurs in Cambridge or London or Berlin or Paris in the last 400 years or so is because of the concentration of privilege through the system that already exists. There are counterexamples to that. I mean, I suppose you could argue that I'm thinking about Bolton and Watt, who weren't, bewigged members of the Royal Society, but they weren't exactly impoverished. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek was not a member of the Royal Society because he was a working man and was rejected on his discovery of the cell for several years until Hooke picked it up. Hooke also, who was not a bewigged member of he was Royal Society. Anyway, I'm trying to explore if any of these examples work, and I think maybe they don't.
One last question, then I'm going to come on to the example that we're going to use to try and explore a range of these different things. But if you believe, and I'm sure you're right, I'm sure Stephen Jay Gould is right. I mean, Einstein was a genius, but geniuses are distributed across the global population. But it does also seem to be the case that if you're really going to push this forward, where there is discovery, you then have to concentrate around it. You can't just then keep distributing. In the same way that one view of human development is that the central institution in the story of human development is just the city. The city is the thing that makes the difference. And it is still as true as it ever was that cities, because they just bring human beings together in very, very close proximity with each other, are the petri dishes of human progress. And so even if you might regret the fact that certain cities or cultures or societies or hierarchies have predominated, actually you're going to need concentrations of resource for this story to push forward at the pace that human beings seem to demand of it.
Well, I completely agree with that. And there's two things I want to say about that. The first is one that I've already mentioned, which is I think that we teach the history of science fundamentally wrong in that we have retained this grip on the great man version of history that you can draw pretty much a straight line from Aristotle to, Stephen Hawking or someone contemporary, and only go via individual men who made great discoveries, and that is how the West was built. Now, apart from the fact that it's simply not true, it also massively misrepresents what science actually is, which is kind of the second point, which is, I think you're alluding to, science is fundamentally a social activity. An individual who is making the greatest discoveries of all time, sitting on his own and not telling anyone about it, has no value to society and has no value to the acquisition of knowledge. I do think, just as a side note in reference to, it sounds like you're sort of umming and ahhing about science as a progressive entity. And I do think that it is. I think it's cumulative. And I think that's different from other forms of cultural transition or the way culture relates to humans. There are very few examples where the cumulative nature of science doesn't occur. I mean, I think there are some blips in the road, but generally the direction is in one way, which is more knowledge. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think I was umming and ahhing more about the word progress than the fact. I mean, it is, people often say that the history of science is fundamentally different from the history of literature or whatever, because it isn't as interesting to study the early thing as it would be with literature, because the early thing has been supplanted. It just has. It's that kind of story. But for the reasons you talked about earlier, when that gets labeled progress, the word progress then leaks into other areas too. It was more that humming and hawing.
Okay. So I agree with that. I am a science communicator. So apart from teaching genetics, I also teach science communication. And I start my master's course by saying all science is science communication. It's not about, whether you're on the radio or writing books. There isn't a form of science which has value unless it is communicated and, by extension, scrutinized and tested according to the methods that we've had in place for a few centuries now. So if we, which I want to, refute the great man Whiggish linear view, and embrace that science is all a social activity and has little value if it's not, then I think you're right that cities, or possibly sort of the broader concept of close social environments where ideas are exchanged, then that is fundamental to the acquisition and accumulation of scientific knowledge, or if we're using the word, progress.
Right, now we're going to talk about an example. We finally come to our counterfactual, but it needed a bit of a preamble because I think what's so interesting about this counterfactual is actually it touches on all of these. So you suggested it, I looked into it, and I found myself completely gripped by this, even though I'm going to get you to explain the science. And it's very unpromising, it might sound like. Not explain the science, I'm going to get you to describe the basic outlines of what we're talking about here. So we're talking about the Haber-Bosch process. And we'll explain what that is. But actually, this is also a story about who. It really does matter who in this case. It really matters when, and it matters where. And there is one counterfactual here, I think, which is tantalizing. But there's also a tragic irony. So tragic ironies are not counterfactuals. Sometimes the world just goes down two paths at the same time. And that's where your irony is. We live in a world which is full of two things happening simultaneously, which aren't the same thing from the same source. With that big build-up, just tell people what the Haber-Bosch process was, is, and what it did.
The caveat here before I start is I'm a geneticist, not a chemist. But I did do chemistry A-level.
But you're more of a chemist than I am.
Okay, so anyone who did chemistry GCSE or chemistry A-level, the Haber-Bosch process is taught, and it's one of those things that is fundamental to understand. It's just part of the English GCSE and A-level syllabus. In very simple terms, it's about the extraction of nitrogen in its atomic or molecular form into usable forms, such as ammonia. It's about the production of ammonia. And there is an equation, which I won't read out. And you learn it, and if you can answer a question on the equation in your A-level exam, you'll pass that question. It was developed in the first decade of the 20th century it's called the Haber-Bosch process because it was developed by Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch. And it was the industrialization and the efficient extraction of nitrogen from atmospheric sources into usable sources. Now, that sounds high concept and of theoretical and possibly chemical interest. But what it actually does is it creates usable nitrogen for us. And already at this stage, when it was being developed, there was the recognition that nitrogen is fundamentally a fertilizer. So the outcome, there's a whole 20th century discussion, there's many, many books written about it. But basically, it is the moment, I said it, but I'm reluctant to say it, but it is an effective moment in the history of invention where we suddenly have access to a thing which has a massive impact on our ability to grow crops. Before that, nitrogen was basically extracted from guano. And there's an interesting backstory to that, which is that guano is really, really significant, and mining of guano is really significant in the history of the British Empire, right? So you take that out of the equation, you've got a different counterfactual. But here's a moment where, as a result of this design process, this chemical process by Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch, we fundamentally changed agriculture. And I'm going to mangle the numbers here, but they're sort of basically made up anyway. As a result of our ability to grow that much more agricultural crops, the population explosion is enabled. We have fed more people, billions more people than we could have done as a result of the existence of this invention. So that's the basics of the Haber-Bosch process.
And on that account, the payoff happened primarily after the Second World War, the Green Revolution, and it spread globally, particularly in Asia. And there are billions of people alive today who you could say would not be alive without the Haber-Bosch process. But on that time frame, presumably, if Haber and Bosch hadn't done it, someone else would. We wouldn't have been waiting until the 1950s for someone to come along and work out how to mass produce on an industrial scale the nitrogen that we need for fertilizers. I'm going to take that for it seems unlikely, given also the uses were so obvious. People would have been on the lookout for this, and someone would have stumbled across it.
I think that's true. It sort of slightly talks to our earlier point about the difference between discovery and invention.
And Haber was the discoverer and Bosch was the application guy, on my understanding.
Yeah, broadly. And, and again, I'm committing the sin that I decry, which is leveling this thing at two people or one person specifically. But, it is named after them. And Fritz Haber is interesting for our discussion in general. But I think that's true.
So it feels to me like there isn't a particularly interesting counterfactual there if the counterfactual is without these two guys, all those billions of people would not exist. I mean, on one level, that's true. There's a specific cause and effect there. But more broadly, a population explosion in the second half of the 20th century might well have happened anyway. But there is another story here because it's not just used for fertilizers.
Well, that is true. But just as a side note, when thinking about the discovery of evolution by natural selection or calculus, I find myself saying, well, it was in the air. The environment, as we talked about, as the intellectual environment, is important. If evolution by natural selection is discovered in 1868 instead of 1858 or even 1878, I don't think the progress of what we understand about evolution is really significantly different today. And the same with calculus in whenever Leibniz and Newton did that. You could, though, argue that if the Haber-Bosch process hadn't come into being until 10 or 20 or 30 years later, the trajectory of the population explosion in the 20th century might be significantly different. And we might not be at 8 billion people now, we may only be at 5 billion people. So, I mean, it's a cul-de-sac, but I think the timing there is more sensitive than it is for something more basic.
Yeah, and 8 billion people, 5 billion people, I accept that's a big difference. But it's also the case with this story that there is a version of history where it's not just a question of decades, but months that it matters. So this requires telling the story in a different way. And this is where the who and the when and the where really matter, because the big advantage of this is that it creates fertilizers that we can use. But the other thing that it made possible to produce on a much greater scale was weaponry and armaments. And also, Haber himself then got closely involved in the creation of chemical weapons. The irony, the tragic irony of Fritz Haber is that he was a Jew. And Albert Einstein described him as embodying the tragic irony of the German Jew. And specifically, he was a Jew from a Prussian family that had been emancipated in the great Prussian emancipation of the Jews at the beginning of the 19th century that I actually talked to the historian Chris Clark about on our episode about anti-Semitism, and what a pivotal event that was, because it created a version of Jewishness where it was almost incumbent on Jews to be more German than the Germans. They were the model citizens. And the Habers, it turns out, fully embraced that role. And they became German patriots, and their Jewishness was sublimated in their idea of Germanness. And Fritz Haber embodied this, so that he makes his great discovery, and Bosch then industrializes it, scales it up. In 1913 and in 1914, there is a war in Europe. And the discovery happens in Germany, and Haber is then put in charge by the German War Ministry of both munitions production and chemical warfare production. And he is an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool patriot. He's not thinking of himself as a Jew. He's thinking of himself as a German. And he's one of the German intellectuals and scientists who go all in on the war. It's the Great War for the fatherland. Now, there is a version of history which says that absent the Haber-Bosch process in 1913, the German military machine would not have been able to produce enough weaponry to sustain the war in 1914 because, as you said, before that, the supplies all depended on, in this case, saltpeter, I think, from Chile, which was controlled by the British, and the British Empire, which was based on control of the seas, meant that Germany could be blockaded from any external imports, could be blockaded from importing what was needed for the mass production of weaponry. So it happens in 1913, and I don't think these things are necessarily related, but in 1914, there's a war. And Germany, which is blockaded and isolated, thanks to Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, is able to supply its army with the weaponry that it needs to sustain this war. So if it happens 2 years later, ... 20th century history could look very, very different. A war that doesn't happen, that ends sooner. If the First World War ends sooner, you don't get the Russian Revolution, you don't get Hitler. There probably should be a rule that counterfactuals shouldn't go down the ... Hitler path, but this one weirdly does.
Yeah, it does. And it's fascinating for that reason. So, I mean, you're right. I hadn't thought about the timing that precisely before now. Again, just another side note, because I turn everything to eugenics because it's what
It's your thing.
it's my thing. But obviously the Third Reich is most closely associated with Hitler's virulent anti-Semitism. And eugenics had been developing in Germany since the 1890s. But during the Weimar years, it wasn't anti-Semitic in its basis. And there were many dyed-in-the-wool German eugenicists, they said it didn't use the word eugenics, they used Rassenhygiene, race hygiene, who argued that German Aryan stock people should mate with Jewish people because Jews were considered to be so intellectually superior and successful. And it's always, I think often people think of that as quite shocking. It's only really with Hitler's anti-Semitic virulence and when Hitler comes to power in February 1933, that a lot of the eugenicists in Germany adopt their anti-Semitism for their generally eugenic views to be enacted. So I wonder, I don't know this because I don't know the history well enough, but I wonder if Haber was, part of that milieu that was, well, actually, it is patriotism and Jewishness is not regarded in the same anti-Semitic virulence as in the Third Reich. So that's one comment. The more specific one that I was thinking is that Haber is also responsible for the development specifically of chlorine as the first chemical weapon. And that's deployed in the Battle of Ypres. And that's 1915. And yes, you're right. He doesn't do that. He misses that by a year or 6 months or whatever. And the outcome of the war is completely different.
And this is also where Haber and Bosch, they part ways. The hyphen has to go. If you look at their histories, Haber is Jewish, Bosch is not. When 1933 comes around, Haber, I think he died in 33, so he didn't live to see much of it, but he lived to see enough of it to know he was now on the road to becoming a persona non grata in the country that he loved. The great German patriot, one of the great patriots of the First World War, the tragedy of many German Jews, which is they wanted to demonstrate their patriotism through their service in the First World War, and it counted for naught in 1933. And Haber was one of those. Bosch, who I think became a critic of the Third Reich and by 1940 was appalled by what happened, but nonetheless, he wasn't Jewish. He was also the founder of IG Farben, the great German chemical company, which used some of his inventions to supply the Nazi state with the gases that it needed to kill the Jews. I mean, Zyklon B, which you can trace it back to the Haber-Bosch process, is the Haber and Bosch, billions of people are alive thanks to the process that they invented, but millions are dead or were dead thanks to the way it came out in industrial production in a certain place, Germany, at a certain time, the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, so, I mean, we can't attribute the invention of Zyklon B to Haber himself, but you're absolutely right. So if the work doesn't happen, Zyklon B isn't invented at the same time and place necessarily. But then I suppose we come back to that question of the use of tools or science or inventions in political ideologies. And it's a hard question to answer, but the Holocaust and the efficiency with which the Nazis did murder 6 million people by the end of the war is certainly aided by Zyklon B. Would they have been as efficient as that without that particular chemical? Would the desire of the Nazis in the Holocaust been quelled by not having such an efficient way of killing so many people? I don't know. It's a weird question to ask, but this is the counterfactual that Fritz Haber never existed.
Yeah, and that seems to me that's the irony rather than the big what if. It's the tragic irony. So when Einstein said that Haber embodied the tragic irony of the German Jew, he was actually referring to the fact that Einstein had been hugely critical of Haber because of his role in developing chemical warfare. And Einstein essentially thought that he was morally corrupt. The tragic irony, as Einstein saw it, was that this man had sold his soul to the German state and the most monstrous wing of the German state. He was the chief chemist in the War Department in Germany during the First World War. And the tragic irony of that was that the German state, by 1933, had no interest in what Fritz Haber had to offer. The deeper irony is that from the processes that he developed, I agree with you, it's not like the Holocaust wouldn't have happened without Zyklon B. The Nazis would have found some way to do their evil work. It might have, everything is different on little turns of history, but this isn't a big counterfactual. It's just the thing that saved billions of lives was the same process that enabled something else, which was monstrous. It seems to me that's the irony. The counterfactual is the First World War one. The weird proximity of the timing of the discovery of this process to the war that shaped everything, the First World War. And we're going to do later on in this series a counterfactual with Chris Clark about what would have happened, if the bullet had missed Franz Ferdinand. That's probably the biggest counterfactual question of all. But here's one that suggests that maybe these nations were heading to war anyway, who knows? But the Germans' ability to prosecute this war sort of depended on not being reliant on something coming from Chile overseas by boat. And it was the Haber-Bosch process that made that possible. So if you take it out, you get a different 20th century. And that's not a tragic irony. That's actually a mind-blowing counterfactual. These two men bumped into each other in a certain context, out of which a process emerged. It could have come a year later, 2 years later. And 1913 means it precedes the ability of the German state to fight that war. And that, to me, actually is a really eerie counterfactual.
Yes, like I said a minute ago, and in the last one, have I talked myself round? Have I talked myself out of the position I started from? It is undeniable that it's the combination of this technological development, which is done by a person or a couple of people, and the outcome is really significant. So the question is then, for me, is this an outlier? Is this such just a cosmic happenstance that occurs at exactly this moment in time? Or can we do this for so many other versions of people and technology that change the course of history? I don't know. What do you think?
It feels like an outlier. So when I was reading about it, I thought, ooh, unusually, this one works. Originally, we were thinking about it in relation to the fact that this one discovery goes down these two paths simultaneously towards what on anyone's account you would say is progress. That is the ability of human beings to sustain a far greater population by producing the food needed to prevent, the escape from the Malthusian trap. This is the ultimate escape from the Malthusian trap. And at the same time, that same invention becomes the facilitator of a brutal, bureaucratic, nightmarish, rationalistic killing machine state, which is the Nazi state. And that those two things could come from the same event seems to me consistent with human history, which is good things happen and shit happens, and they might have the same cause. The 1913, 1914 thing I found eerily spooky and actually I think pretty unusual, because the First World War, there's nothing to compare it with. It's the event that shaped everything that followed in the 20th century. So if there is something that lies in the year before that, which if you pull it out of the history, can really take it on a different path, you do have a different world. Just a reminder, if you would like to hear our bonus episode on Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which is the great counterfactual novel about what might have happened if America had elected a fascist president, you can get it on PPF Plus. And to subscribe, you just need to go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. Next time in this series, I'm going to be talking to the historian Aisha Zarakol about a really big counterfactual. What if China, and not the West, had come to dominate the world in the 18th and 19th century? Just how contingent is a world that is dominated by the West rather than the rest? And what might have made the difference? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.